I hope everybody's having a good Saturday afternoon, and it's good to be back this week. Last weekend I was out of town. Angel and I were celebrating our 28th wedding anniversary, and appreciate Bob Whitty preaching at the church last Sunday for our worship service. And unfortunately, they had some technical difficulties and weren't unable to upload and post his message from last Sunday. But I'm back today, and we're going to continue our study through the epistle of James. And so I just want to start off by asking this question: Are you a good driver? And to drive means to control or to direct. How many of you think that you are a good driver? How many of you think you're a bad driver? Out where we live, west of CJ, Angel and I built a house next to my parents when we got married, and my nephew and his wife built a house next to us when they got married, and my sister Mindy and her brother and my brother-in-law Eric, they built a house behind my parents' house when they moved back into the area, and so we jokingly call this the Ross compound, and we normally all gather at my parents' house on Sundays for lunch, and a lot of times, we have fun as a family, and this oftentimes involves driving things. My little great nephew Cohen is usually on his Power Wheel, and his brother Corbin on the go-kart. And then usually someone's on the ATV, and then sometimes they have one or two riding lawnmowers going at the same time. So lots of different things are being driven, and it can get kind of crazy at times. And let's just say this, there are some people in my family that are better at driving than others. We've had a few accidents and miscues over the years. And my son Tanner's actually been to the ER a couple of different times. But driving. Are you a good driver? My daughter Kinsley turns 1 next month, and we're talking about buying her this Power Wheel that comes with a remote control, where we can control the car and where it goes until she's old enough to drive it herself. So that'll be kind of fun. But the fact is, people drive all kinds of things. There's remote control cars, there's Power Wheels, there's cars, there's tractors, there's go-karts, four-wheelers, lawnmowers, boats. How about a golf ball? How many of you guys have ever driven a golf ball? I'm not very good at driving a golf ball. When I drive a golf ball, there is just absolutely no telling where this thing's going to go. And I have some pretty embarrassing stories that I could tell you. At Schipperdecker, I've hit golf balls onto 7th Street. At Briarbrook one time, a guy was out watching his car, and I hit a golf ball, and it bounced up and hit his car. So that's just a couple of many. But here's the question: is when it comes to your life, how good of a driver are you? What is the driving force in your life? What drives you? In Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Life, he said everyone is driven by something. That people, some people are driven by guilt. They spend their lives running from regrets, and they allow the past to control their future. Some people are driven by anger and resentment. They hold on to hurts, and they refuse to release their pain through forgiveness. Some people are driven by fear. They play life safe. They avoid taking any risk, not realizing that fear is a self-imposed prison that will keep them from becoming the person that God intends them to be. Some people are driven by the need for approval. They allow expectations of parents, spouses, friends, coaches to control their lives. They worry about what other people think, and when you're constantly doing that, it's a sure way to miss God's will for your life. Some people are driven by materialism. They have this misconception that having more will make them happy. And, possessions only provide temporary happiness. Only a relationship with Jesus provides eternal joy. Some people are driven by the pursuit of happiness. When American mothers were asked, what do you wish for your kids? The overwhelming answer is that they want them to be happy. I think everyone wants to be happy. But what happens when your possessions wear out, when a loved one dies, when your health deteriorates, when the money's gone? People whose lives are driven by this, their happiness flees and despair sets in. So, what's the driving force in your life? Maybe you could relate to some of these. Oftentimes you hear people say, what on earth am I here for? Or does God have a purpose for my life? And I would say, yes, absolutely, God has a purpose for your life. I mean, Isaiah 44:2 says, I am your creator. You were in my care even before you were born. In Psalms 119, it says, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. You know me inside and out. You know every bone in my body. You know exactly how I was made, bit by bit, how I was sculpted from nothing into something. Colossians 1:16 says, for everything, absolutely everything, above and below, visible and invisible, all things were created by him and for him. God is our creator. We were in his care even before we were born. And we were all fearfully and wonderfully made. We are created by God and for God. So yes, absolutely, God has a purpose for our lives. But what we need to understand is that it's not about you and it's not about me. Oftentimes, you hear people like, what do I want to be? What should I do with my life? What are your ambitions? What are your hopes? What are your dreams? Those are all self-centered questions. If we want to know why we were placed on this planet, we have to begin with God. We were created by God and for God. The title of my message this week is Responding to God's Will. How many of us would say that the driving force in our life is to do God's will? We're going to be in James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, and I just want to start off by just reading those verses. It starts off here in James 4, verse 13. Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are just a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. But as it is, you boast and you brag, and all such boasting is evil. Anyone then who knows the good that he ought to do and doesn't do it sins. So as we continue this series through the Epistle of James, in these verses, James identifies doing the will of God as another test of genuine faith. There are many scriptures that talk about doing God's will. David wrote in Psalms 40, verse 8, I desire to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart. In Psalm 143:10, David went on to say, teach me to do your will, for you are my God. I think about in Mark chapter 3, shortly after Jesus started his ministry, his brothers showed up at a house wanting to take charge of Jesus, thinking that Jesus was just completely out of his mind. And so they tell Jesus, your mother and brothers are outside looking for you. And then Jesus responded by saying, who are my mother and my brothers? Then he looked at those seated around him and said, here are my mother and brothers. And in Mark 3:35, he says, whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. I think about the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, when he was modeling how to pray, he says, our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. He went on to say on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 7:21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. And in 1 John 2:17, John wrote, "The world and its desires will pass away, but the man who does the will of God lives forever." You know, the greatest example of one who did the will of God was Jesus. I mean, Jesus said, I have come down from heaven not to do my will, but the will of him who sent me. I think about in John chapter 4, his disciples, went into town to get food, and Jesus stayed back by the well, and he ministered to a Samaritan woman at the well. And when the disciples came back, they were focused on the food and the earthly things. But Jesus said this, he says, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work." I think about at the Garden of Gethsemane, facing the agony of the cross, Jesus prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not my will, but your will be done." And before Jesus took his last breath on the cross, he said, "It is finished." Well, what was finished? God's will. Jesus had accomplished what God had sent him to do, to be the perfect sacrifice, to die on the cross for the sins of mankind. Jesus perfectly modeled obedience to God's will. And so for James, doing God's will identifies another test of genuine faith. And to disregard or to have no interest in God's will shows the presence of pride. And it's saying, "I'm the ruler of my own life." And James already pointed out in James 4:6 that God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. So here in James 4:13 through 17, James uses the illustration of a business person's plans to give us insight into how people respond to God's will. So the first thing that he talks about is the foolishness of ignoring God's will. I'll read verses 13 and 14 again. It says, "Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, and we're going to spend a year there, and we're going to carry on business, and we're going to make some money." He says, "Why? You don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for just a little while and then vanishes." So this is a person whose response to God's will is ignoring it, living as if God doesn't exist. James starts out by saying here, he's saying, now listen, he's saying, listen up. The illustration he uses here would have been familiar, to his readers, because, many Jewish people had been scattered about and were successful business people or striving to be. And here's the thing, wise planning and strategies in business is not a sin. It's actually commendable. The problem lies in what they did not do. During the course of their planning, they totally ignored God. God was not a part of their plan or of their agenda. I mean, they chose the time, they chose the location, they chose how long, they chose the business, they chose their objective, which was to make money. And again, James isn't attacking them wanting to make a profit. He's attacking their exclusion of God. Jesus told a parable similar to this in Luke chapter 12, verses 16 through 21. It's the parable of the rich fool. And Jesus said, the land of a rich man was very productive. And he reasoned with, who did he reason with? He reasoned with himself and said, "What shall I do?" He says, since I have no place to store my crops. He goes, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns, and I will build larger barns, and I will store up all my grain. And then I will say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be for those who store up for things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. In this story here in James tells us two reasons it is foolish to leave God out of our plans. And the first one is, he says, none of us know what will happen tomorrow. Proverbs 27:1 says, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth." You know, as we know, life it's far from simple. Oftentimes in life, there are many circumstances that we have little or no control over. This virus is a great example of that. This virus has changed plans for everyone over and over again. We often have little to no control over our circumstances, but despite that, some people foolishly think they're in charge of their lives. That not only ignore the existence of God's will, but they're missing the benefit of living a life according to God's will. As Christians, we have the comfort of knowing that God is in control. And every event and circumstance in our lives, God weaves them into his perfect plan. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose." Proverbs 3:5-6 tells us, "Trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all of your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight." We may never know why some things go the way they do, or why some things happen. But God knows. And as Christians, we don't lean on our own understanding. We trust in the Lord with all of our hearts, and we acknowledge him in what we do, and we have the promise that he will be with us, that he will make our paths straight. None of us know what will happen tomorrow. The second reason he gives for being foolish to leave God out of our plans is our life is short. He says, "What is your life? You are a mist that appears for just a little while and then vanishes." James reminds them that life is short. It's like the morning dew. It's like a puff of smoke. Psalm 102 verse 11 says, "My days are like the evening shadow. I wither away like grass." How foolish it is in the frailty of earthly life to live without any consideration for God's will. That's just foolish. And then in verses 16 and 17, he talks about the sin of disobeying God's will. In verses 16 and 17, he says, "As it is, you boast and brag, and all such boasting is evil. Anyone then who knows the good he ought to do, and he doesn't do it, sins." So he talks here about the arrogance of a person who rejects God's will, who sets their will above God's will. We've probably all been guilty of that at times, setting aside God's will in favor of our own plans. I've talked about this before, but, I can remember my time in youth ministry at Fur Road. I really thought I would just stay on staff and be the youth minister at Fur Road until I retired from my job with the state in 2022, and then I would go into full-time ministry. But as we know, God had other plans for me, and I've been here at Centerpoint now for over 4 years now, and here's the thing: I'm eligible to retire in about 18 months from my state job, and I get asked a lot, am I going to retire? And here's the thing: I would like to say yes, but I really don't know. I mean, a lot can happen in 18 months. And as we just talked about, I don't even know what tomorrow's going to bring. But here's the thing: God does. And I want to strive to live every day doing what God wants me to do. And we need to all to put God's will at the center of our planning. In verse 17, he says, "Anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins." We tend to think that doing things that are wrong is sin, but James tells us sin is also not doing what is right. Those who know God's will are responsible to obey it, and if they fail to do so, they sin. I think of the story of Jonah. I mean, this is a classic story of a prophet who knew the will of God but refused to do it. He was called by God to go preach to the people of Nineveh. Well, pagan people lived in Nineveh, and they were evil and they were doing terrible things. And Jonah didn't want to go there. He didn't want them to repent. In fact, he wanted God to destroy them. And so Jonah attempted to go the complete opposite direction. And as we know, it didn't work out very well for him. He got thrown off of a ship into the sea in the middle of a storm, and he was swallowed by a great fish. But after being disciplined by God, he submitted to God's will, and he went to Nineveh and preached, and the whole city repented and turned from their wicked ways. Guys, there may be some of you listening today that God is calling you to do something for his kingdom. And maybe like Jonah, you're resisting God's will. You're attempting to run away. Man, I encourage you to submit to whatever it is that God is calling you to do. And then here's the last thing I want to talk about, the blessing of acknowledging God's will. In verse 15, he said, instead you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and we will do this or that. Why do you think James insists that we say, if it's the Lord's will, we will do this or that? Because that mindset indicates submission to God and to his will. A genuine Christian submits his plans to the Lord habitually, continually, in every aspect of their lives. Doing the will of God should be the driving force in our lives. Someone has said that about 90% of God's will for our lives is already revealed to us in his word. In other words, God has already unveiled what should be the primary direction of our lives, and as we obey those broad principles, he will make the details clear. And if that is true, then a careful study and knowledge of Scripture is imperative for all believers. Psalm 119, 105, verse 105 says, your word is a lamp to my feet and a light for my path. Do you believe that? And then the other question I have is, are we teaching our children that? While I was the youth minister at Fur Road, I did a series with our students based off Rick Warren's book, A Purpose-Driven Life. And so many of our students, they're searching and they're trying to figure things out. And between the ages of 15 and 25, a lot of major life decisions are made. And in his book, he identifies 5 purposes that I did in this series with the students. And that is, first of all, one of them is worship. You are playing for God's pleasure. The second one is fellowship. You were formed to be a part of God's family. The third one is discipleship. You were created to become like Christ. The fourth one was ministry, and you were shaped for serving God. And then the fifth one is evangelism, that we were made for a mission to share the gospel. And the thing that I tried to drive home with our students was to let Jesus validate who they are. Not your parents, not your friends, not your boyfriend or girlfriend, not your coaches, not your sports, not this crazy culture that we live in. Let Jesus validate who you are. I wanted so badly for the driving force in their lives to be to do the will of God, for them to love God and to love others. Guys, parents, it's our responsibility to teach this to our children. And the best way to teach it to them is by modeling it in our lives. I'm just going to close by reading a scripture that's probably pretty familiar to people. It's in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. It says, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And then You will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, perfect will. Guys, that's our spiritual act of worship. I hope you have a great rest of the weekend. God bless.